Hello, welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. I'm pastor of Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley, California, in my 36th year there. And we are doing the Bible study, Gospel of John. We're in John chapter 19, verses 17 to 27. I know the lighting is not good. We are not able to be in the studio. We're in TV, doing it at home with the best week thing we got going, so we're going to do it. The program, the passage is called the Crucifixon. The Crucifixon. It's very interesting that the centerpiece of Christianity have to do with a cross, an instrument of execution. But that's what it is. By the way, crucifixion was invented someplace around the 8th century BCE. The Greeks used it, the Romans used it, and there were 3 different kind of crosses. There was St. Andrew's cross, which was an X, St. Andrew's cross. And then St. Anthony's cross was a T, like a capital T. Here's the stake, the saruo, and then the crossbeam, the patibulum. And then the Latin cross was like a small T, which is the cross that you normally see, but there's all kinds of different crosses. But anyway, those are the 3 primary ones. So we have a faith that's all built around someone dying as a criminal on a Roman cross. Very interesting. And so our core message, the core message of Christianity is that Messiah, Son of God, Jesus, was crucified, put to death on a cross. Very interesting. All of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, mention, of course, deal with the cross. John's is the shortest of all of the 4. Also, John does not tell us about Simon of Cyrene. And John does not tell us about the scourging that occurred prior to the crucifixion. The other gospel writers, 2 of them at least, mention it. And that scourging was very brutal. People died from it. They had a paddle with long leather straps, pieces of metal or bone were at the end. They threw it over. Person was bound to a particular column and bareback, probably naked, and this wrecked over it. It opened up bones, and many times people died. It was the crucifixion in the Roman style with the scourging was absolutely horrific. All right, so we've talked about that. I want to mention something about the staruo, the cross. Staruo means stake, and very interestingly, I have nothing against these folks, but they have an error. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they say that Jesus did not die on a cross, but a stake. Complete misunderstanding. The saruo was the stake. It was often left at the site of the execution. It was just there, always there. Crosses were there, right there. And then the condemned carried the crossbeam. And the word for that is, I hope I pronounce it right, patibulum, Patibulum in Latin. And the convict, the condemned, had to carry that, and so that's what happened. And Jesus, when it says carried the cross, the saruo, that was the name for the whole of the thing. And because of the scourging, he fell, and when Simon of Cyrene picked it up and carried it for him, but again, not mentioned by John. So I think we'll start now into the text. beginning with verse 16b. A little story I have to tell you. This story begins, it has 4 words. So they took Jesus, and then we have verse 17. I actually just read the last section of verse 16. What happened was, you'll find this in a number of places in the scripture. The story is the guy who made the chapter and the verse said where they were. Would be riding in a chariot, some kind of thing like a stagecoach. This is hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before King James. And if there were a bump or something, he'd make a mark there, and sometimes he missed, didn't do it right. This is one of those cases. The very end of 16 says, so they took Jesus, but then it goes on in 17, and he went out bearing his cross. The word is saruo, with a cross beam, to the place called the place of the skull. And that word in the Greek is craniou, and in Latin is cranium, your cranium, your head, the place of the skull. Some said, well, the place looked like a skull, or there were skulls left there. What the Romans would typically do, they would not bury the body; they'd leave it there for the vultures, and those are fierce birds. We have a lot of them around here. I see turkey vultures every single day flying around here, and they would just leave the bodies there. They wouldn't take them down. It was just part of the humiliation for family and friends. Say, okay, here he is. The place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Golgotha. Now, the Latin equivalent of Golgotha is Calvary. Calvary, and you'll find the word Calvary a lot in all kinds of places. Names of a church that was started by Chuck Smith back in the early 1970s, and so Calvary, Golgotha. This is the place where Jesus was crucified. Verse 18, there they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Now, there's a passage of scripture, Isaiah 53:12 says, he was numbered with the transgressors, in reference to the Messiah, 750 BCE, numbered with the transgressors. Very interesting. There is a Canon Liddon is his name, Canon Liddon. I don't know when he lived, but he was an archaeologist, and he looked at the Hebrew Bible from Genesis to Chronicles, or in our last book, in our and said there were 332 direct references, prophetic references to Jesus and the cross and the whole Christian thing, 332. So here's one of them, Isaiah 53:12, numbered with the transgressors. They put Jesus in the middle. It's interesting. And we don't know who did this. Pilate had to have done this. No, the Jewish authorities could not have done this. Pilate had to have done this. And why he did that has been subject to for a lot of speculation over the years. I don't have any idea. Okay. Verse 19, Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. That's a titulus, or title, when it breaks down into English. Titulus is the word for inscriptions, is writing. And they would place it upon the cross. By the way, Jesus was not very high off the ground. Maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet off the ground. It was right there close. It wasn't very high up. And so here's the inscription. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they talk about this, but they don't use the term of Nazareth. It says Jesus, the King of the Jews. But John was there. He's the only one of the gospel writers who was there. And he could see what it was. And it was Jesus of Nazareth, all in capital letters, the King of the Jews. So just an interesting little point that we have, because we know that John was an eyewitness. Okay, verse 20. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. This would have been as people were coming in from the north into Jerusalem for Passover, and by the hundreds of thousands. They would come from the east and the west, some from the south, but this was the main thoroughfare, because the Mediterranean world was north. And so so he was crucified there, and so here came people in. And by the way, the placing of this placard was very common. Now, John says it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and Greek. Now, Aramaic would have been the national language. Most Jewish people would have spoken Aramaic. Anybody in Judea area would have been speaking Aramaic. Then in Latin, that was the official language. Now, that would have been the language used by the Roman government, Latin, and by the soldiers, Latin. But it was also written in Greek. This was what we'd call a common language. That Latin was just replacing Greek sometime before this, and was becoming the chief language, Latin. Greek was beginning to disappear. Verse 21. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews." So the chief priest said this. Now, you have to ask yourself, how do we know this? I love to ask that question. How do we know that? Where did this information come from? In other words, how did John know this? He writes this. How does he know this? Well, let's think about that a second. The chief priests. We're going to see, and it's going to be in the next program, we're going to talk about two guys, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They were both members of the Council of Israel. It's called the Sanhedrin. And they would probably have been privy to these kinds of things, either at the time or sometime later. We know these people became Christians. They were followers of Jesus. And there were likely a number of others. We find at Pentecost, there was likely other people who were called priests, who became followers of Jesus. So this would have been probably common knowledge throughout the Christian community at a fairly early date. So the chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather the man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" They took offense at the thing that Pilate wrote. And you can imagine how they would do that. But nevertheless, Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." The Jews saw what he had written as a really blasphemous insult. Philo of Alexandria, who lived somewhat after this time, but very acquainted with all of these events, would have been big news for many decades. He said of Pilate, "By nature obstinate and stubborn." Obstinate and stubborn. And so that's what he has. And so he says, What I have written, I have written. That's it. He turned them away, just like that. Verse 23. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, we know that there were 4 soldiers. How do we know that? Because what comes next? They took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier. So, very, very clear. The text shows that. There's some indication from ancient records that the execution committee of soldiers that took care of this. There were 4. There were 4 of them. So when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, so they've got Jesus up on a cross. There's been a number of artistic renditions of this, and that's about all we've got. We don't know if they hoisted him up. Some people say that they laid him down, they nailed his hands to the crossbeam and then hoisted him up. A couple of big guys could have done that. There were 4 soldiers. They could have easily done that. Put him up on top of the saruo, the pillar, the stake. Put him up there on that. And then proceed to pound spikes through his ankles. And there's a question about how that went. There was a little down about a foot up above his feet, well, a little apparatus. There's a technical name for it. It escapes me right now. It was built out a little bit, piece of wood there, that the condemned person on the cross could actually kind of hoist himself up. Because what happened, people would die of asphyxiation because they couldn't breathe. They would sink and sink and sink. Well, that little thing was there, and they could hoist themselves up. And what that served to do, it served to prolong the agony and the pain. It served because they would just do this because you're gasping for air, and then so you can hoist yourself up a little bit. So anyway, that's a little picture. We're not sure that the cross, this cross, had that feature or not. You'll see some artist renderings when it has one, and they're nailed together, and so on. But at any rate, so that's what they did. Chrysostom, one of the means the golden mouth one, was a preacher some hundreds of years later. He wrote about these clothes. He says they were the clothes of a poor man. Another thing I would mention right now, there's a passage in Genesis 50, verse 20, that says, God brings good things out of evil. God brings good out of evil. It's called the doctrine of concurrence in theological terms. Oddly enough, even things that are awful and that are evil, God uses for good and uses them for his glory. And here we see that exact thing. So they divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, and his tunic. The tunic, now, this was worn next to the skin. It was you could say it was the undergarment. And so that's what they did. It was seamless. If you cut it up with a sword or something, they would just mangle it. So they weren't going to do that. They each had a piece. The pieces were, here's some possibilities of what Jesus had on. Could have had a headdress, something to wear on top, not unusual in that area, in that era, with the sun always beaten down, very hot. Of course, the inner garment, the tunic that I just mentioned, an outer garment called a chiton, worn over, and a girdle that kind of like a belt that kept everything going, and of course the potential for shoes. So we don't exactly, he doesn't list the actual garments except for the tunic. And the passage goes on to say at the end of 23, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Notice it says it was woven. We underestimate ancient peoples and how sophisticated they were, but they knew how to wove together fabrics, cotton, some maybe papyrus, wool. And so here it is that they had the capacity, but this was woven. That's what it means. It was somehow on some kind of apparatus that was developed, and the pieces would be woven together. And it says in one piece from top to bottom. Verse 24, so they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, and see who it shall be. Now, you have to ask the question again, how did John know that? How did John know? It's not a case of Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, right there with the priestly people. They're four guys, Roman soldiers. How did John get this information? Well, I guess it could only be that one of these became a Christian. Maybe two, maybe three, maybe all of them. I don't know if you remember the movie Ben-Hur, the great old version Ben-Hur, and it seems to me that in the depiction of the crucifixion, there was a kind of a short shot of one of the soldiers, and he had sort of a different look on his face, and maybe that's what was attempting to be shown there. So they cast lot for it. They didn't tear the garment, and here's the thing. It says this was to fulfill the scripture which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That is from Psalm 22:18, one of those 332 prophecies about Jesus that Canon Liddon made a list of. Okay. And, it's very interesting. This is Psalm 22, Psalm of David, again, 1,000 years earlier written. And there was nothing in the life of David that we have, and we have a very detailed account of David's life, that there's no relevance in any part of David's life that's revealed in Scripture that would make us say, oh, that's referring to that part of David's life. This happened in some event in David's life. No, there's no such thing. It's completely out of the blue. And that's the way dozens of these prophecies are. You're reading along and all of a sudden, bammo, there's one. And it doesn't fit the context. It just stands out like a big light. So they cast lots. So the soldiers did these things. Now we have something very interesting. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Here they are. They're standing right there. You got to be fairly close because Jesus is going to be talking to them. So they're going to be close. Tremendous amount of courage that they're showing, these four women. We're going to find that John is right there too. There's actually 5 people, John and the 4 ladies. There's some question, maybe there's 3. There's 3 women. It's hard to know. But my guess is that there were 4, and my best commentators say there were 4. And here they are. Here is Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's now looking upon her son, who is there bloody, naked, dying, very close to death at this point. And there they are, great courage to do that. And so we know there was Mary, Mary's sister. Now the question is, Luke mentioned a Joanna, but Matthew, Mark, and John do not mention Joanna. Maybe that was a sister of Mary that we don't know, other than what Luke says. Some say it was Salome. Again, that's hard to know. Mary, the wife of Clopas. We don't know anything really about Clopas. And then Mary Magdalene. She was one of those who anointed Jesus. Notice there are four Marys, at least four Marys. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, Mary. Miriam was the sister of Moses and Aaron, the first high priest. And the Mary is more of a Latin rendering of Miriam, and a lot of Jewish women by the name of Mary. So this is not totally without some understanding. Now Mary is there. It says, verse 26, when Jesus saw his mother, you get almost the picture of a tremendous amount of suffering here, suffering that Jesus experienced. When Jesus was dedicated at the temple, Mary and Joseph took Jesus, and they encountered a man named Simeon. And Simeon was an old man, he was a prophet, and he said to Mary, that, I'm looking for it. I'm looking for the statement that Simeon made. He said, a sword will pierce through you too. In other words, the idea was Simeon, even back there at Jesus' infancy, was prophesied by Simon that she was going to go through traumatic experience. So his mother and the disciple whom he loved, that's John, of course, standing nearby. By the way, he says he loved. This does not mean that there was a homosexual relationship between Jesus and young John. Not at all. Had it been, Jesus would have been killed years ago. Soon, homosexuality was not permitted. Terrible at that point. He did. No, people will try to say, well, they had a gay relationship. That's garbage. He said to his mother, woman, behold your son. He says, gune. Gune, we get our word gynecology from that. It was a common word for woman. It was an honorific title. Jesus said that to her at the wedding of Canaan, and it was also used in John 8 of the woman caught in adultery. Woman, behold your son. Behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. Some people say that John lived with Mary in Jerusalem for 11 years. She died at age 59. Another says that Mary went with John to Ephesus and was buried there. Okay, so long.